Okay, so we're going to continue our discussion of the civil rights movement. We finished last time with Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail. And now we're going to look at the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So first I'm going to play a clip from Alabama Governor George Wallace.
That today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generation of forebears before us done time and again down through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us, and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
So there you have this Alabama governor who makes this stirring speech where he says segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. And that's in 1963 in his inauguration address. Later, he would personally stand in front of the University of Alabama preventing African American students from attending, even though it was federal law they'd be able to attend. So the next thing we're going to watch is John F. Kennedy.
The Washington, D.C. School Rock Report.
John F. Kennedy's response to George Wallace. Hold on. Gotta get to the right spot.
Following a series of threats and defiant statements, the presence of Alabama National Guardsmen was required on the University of Alabama to carry out the final and unequivocal order of the United States District Court of the Northern District of Alabama. That order called for the admission of two clearly qualified young Alabama residents who happened to have been born Negro. That they were admitted peacefully on the campus is due in good measure to the conduct of the students of the University of Alabama who met their responsibilities in a constructive way. I hope that every American, regardless of where he lives, will stop and examine his conscience about this and other related incidents. This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. Today we are committed to a worldwide struggle to promote and protect the rights of all who wish to be free. And when Americans are sent to Vietnam or West Berlin, we do not ask for whites only. It ought to be possible, therefore, for American students of any color to attend any public institution they select without having to be backed up by troops. It ought to be possible for American consumers of any color to receive equal service in places of public accommodation, such as hotels and restaurants and theaters and retail stores, without being forced to resort to demonstrations in the street. And it ought to be possible for American citizens of any color to register and to vote in a free election without interference or fear of reprisal. It ought to be possible, in short, for every American to enjoy the privileges of being American without regard to his race or his color. In short, every American ought to have the right to be treated as he would wish to be treated, as one would wish his children to be treated. But this is not the case. The Negro baby born in America today, regardless of the section of the state in which he is born, has about one-half as much chance of completing a high school as a white baby, born in the same place on the same day. One-third as much chance of completing college. One-third as much chance of becoming a professional man. twice as much chance of becoming unemployed, about 1/7 as much chance of earning $10,000 a year, a life expectancy which is 7 years shorter, and the prospects of earning only half as much. This is not a sectional issue. Difficulties over segregation and discrimination exist in every city, in every state of the Union, producing in many cities a rising tide of discontent that threatens the public safety. Nor is this a partisan issue. In a time of domestic crisis, men of goodwill and generosity should be able to unite regardless of party or politics. This is not even a legal or legislative issue alone. It is better to settle these matters in the courts than on the streets, and new laws are needed at every level. But law alone cannot make men see right. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free. We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it. And we cherish our freedom here at home. But are we to say to the world, and much more importantly, to each other, that this is a land of the free, except for the Negroes, that we have no second-class citizens, except Negroes, that we have no class or caste system, no ghettos, no master race, except with respect to Negroes? Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south. Where legal remedies are not at hand, redress is sought in the streets, in demonstrations, parades, and protests, which create tensions and threaten violence and threaten lives. We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and a people. It cannot be met by repressive police action. It cannot be left to increase demonstrations in the streets. It cannot be quieted by token moves or talk. It is a time to act in the Congress, in your state and local legislative body, and above all, in all of our daily lives. It is not enough to pin the blame on others, to say this is a problem of one section of the country or another, or deplore the facts that we face. A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all. Those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly are recognizing right as well as reality. Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it is not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law. The federal judiciary has upheld that proposition in a series of forthright cases. The executive branch has adopted that proposition in the conduct of its affairs, including the employment of federal personnel, the use of federal facilities, and the sale of federally financed housing. But there are other necessary measures which only the Congress can provide, and they must be provided at this session. The old code of equity law under which we live commands for every wrong a remedy. But in too many communities, in too many parts of the country, wrongs are inflicted on Negro citizens, and there are no remedies at law. Unless the Congress acts, their only remedy is the street. I am therefore asking the Congress to enact legislation giving all Americans the right to be served in facilities which are open to the public: hotels, restaurants, theaters, retail stores, and similar establishments. This seems to me to be an elementary right. Its denial is an arbitrary indignity that no American in 1963 should have to endure.
Okay, so all right, so that was Kennedy's response to George Wallace's defiance. And what he's doing there is he's laying the groundwork for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And as he mentioned in the speech, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would guarantee, using federal law, that any establishment, etc., could not restrict access based on race. And so that's fundamental now in our country. They legislated in the Civil Rights Act the end of segregation. And so that's a monumental moment. This is what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the other civil rights activists were moving toward, was a civil rights act preventing racism, making racism and segregation illegal. But their fight obviously was not done. So to further push forward on this Civil Rights Act that J.F. Kennedy proposed, they had a march on Washington. You see that on the top of page 8 in your notes. Hopefully you have your notes out here. And so August 28, 1963, they organized a march on Washington, D.C. 200,000 plus people go to the Lincoln Memorial. And that's where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gives his I Have a Dream speech. And I had you listen to that last week. So hopefully you did. If you didn't, you need to. It's one of the greatest speeches in American history. And he uses imagery from My Country 'Tis of Thee, and he says that he wants his children to be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. And that message resounds still today. Well, as you also saw in the video I had you watch last week, John F. Kennedy was assassinated November 22, 1963 in the streets of Dallas. And the Civil Rights Act still had not been made into law. And so then it was up to Lyndon B. Johnson, who took over for Kennedy after the assassination. And Johnson was a very skilled politician, had been in government for a long time, knew a lot more of the tricks of the trade than John F. Kennedy. And so he helped push the Civil Rights Act through, which was monumentous because he was a Southerner. And he went against the tide of Southern segregation. It's also important to note that the segregationists in Congress tried to stop the Civil Rights Act from being signed into law, and they did that by using 87 days of filibuster. And filibuster, you'll learn about this in government class, but basically filibuster is when congressmen are allowed to talk about nothing really, as long as they keep talking, to prevent debate and discussion about a bill so that it will die. And you need, in those days, I think you needed 2/3 vote from the Senate to vote down the filibuster. And so, yeah, it took 87 days to do that. 87 days of just wasted time as the segregationists were trying to prevent the Civil Rights Act. So July 2, 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law. The next great issue for African Americans then was the voting issues. So they have the Civil Rights Act, but they still aren't voting. It helped that the 24th, I believe, amendment was passed, forbidding poll taxes, which is when you have to pay to vote. And that, remember, poll taxes were started back in the Reconstruction era. But the pressure, as civil rights activists were moving into the South to try to encourage voting and voting registration, the Ku Klux Klan and white segregationists began fighting back. And they did this by bombing African American churches, for example, and killing and beating activists. 24 African American churches were bombed in just a few months stretch in 1964. So the Selma March, they decided to do a nonviolent, a peaceful protest march in Selma, Alabama, in the early part of 1965. And the majority of Selma were African Americans. However, only 3% were registered to vote. And so this was a march to expose this. And I'm going to show a video clip here where you see that they're attacked by over 200 Alabama state troopers or highway police as they were kneeling in prayer. The protesters were kneeling in prayer. And they put 70 African Americans in the hospital. This was on TV. It's called Bloody Sunday, and just exposed the violent hatred of white people in the South against blacks. And then, so this march, the Selma March, would be rescheduled because they didn't actually finish the march. It would be rescheduled with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. there. He said that he would rather die on the highway outside of Selma than have his conscience butchered because he was receiving death threats if he went. And I thought that was pretty profound. He was willing to die for his beliefs in civil rights. And so because of the Selma March and because of all the attention it drew because of the violence, President Johnson gave a speech and said, "We shall overcome," using the very language of the civil rights movement. And they signed the Voting Rights Act August 6, 1965, which guaranteed blacks the right to vote, which was part of the 15th Amendment. But this is a law that's allowing the federal government to force this to happen, because the last 100 years, as you know, blacks were not allowed to vote. So I'm going to show you that video clip now.
Many do. I've recently met with scores of business leaders.
Sorry, John F. Kennedy will not be stopped.
Preoccupied as he was with the growing war in Vietnam, President Johnson knew that he had to address problems at home. Despite America's prosperity, 40 million citizens still live below the poverty line.
And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
In May 1964, the president unveiled the grand plan for what he called the Great Society. Mr. Johnson hoped to match the power and vitality of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, with a list of welfare, job, and educational opportunities to aid underprivileged Americans. But the privilege that many Southern blacks most desired was the right to vote, still often denied them. In Selma, Alabama, 97% of 15,000 eligible black voters were unregistered. Some because of cynicism or apathy, but most because they faced violence and intimidation from local authorities.
People could only attempt to register on the first and third Mondays of each month.
The Board of Registrars is not in session this afternoon, as you informed. He came down to make a mockery out of his courthouse.
And you had to get some white person to vouch that you were a good character. No white person in his right mind in the state of Alabama was going to vouch that a black person was a good character.
If we're wrong, why don't you arrest us? We've come to register.
Selma rapidly became the new flashpoint of the civil rights movement. On March the 7th, 1965, 600 civil rights activists planned a march that was to take them from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery, some 54 miles away. Their route would take the non-violent demonstrators through what amounted to enemy territory, roads and highways controlled by the Alabama State Police.
And they came toward us, beating up with nightsticks, with bullwhips, and trampling us with horses. I was hit in the head and just left lying there. And I felt like it was the last protest.
The violence and brutality which ended this march quickly provoked plans for a much larger one, now joined by Dr. Martin Luther King.
We've gone too far now to turn back.
Dr. King was determined to focus national attention on Selma, and he enlisted the help of supporters from New York to Hollywood.
The Reverend said, the white man can't cool it because he's never dug it.
Marlon Brando was the one that got me involved in civil rights, honestly. I was walking down the street and he just pulled up in the car and he said, how'd you like to go down to Selma? Yeah? I said, Selma? Selma, we're going to have a march from Selma to Montgomery. You want to come? And I said, sure.
Before the second march had even begun, the Reverend James Reeb, a civil rights sympathizer, was beaten to death by a white mob. But rather than intimidating the marchers, that violence seemed to give them a powerful ally.
That night, I was with Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma, and we heard Lyndon Johnson. We watched him make one of the greatest speeches any American president ever made on the whole question of civil rights.
Their cause must be our cause too. It's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
Just think of a president with a Southern accent from Texas saying to the Congress of the United States, we shall overcome. Finally, popular protest and public power had come together.
And Dr. King literally started crying. Tears came down his face. I knew then that we would make it from Selma to Montgomery.
On March 21st, 1965, 3,200 people set out from Selma. 4 days later, as the march approached Montgomery, there were 25,000 people marching.
It was an amazing moment. It was scary. It was scary. There were helicopters everywhere, like some sort of angry bugs. And there were only Confederate flags flying. We were the only ones with American flags. Yeah, and Martin Luther King gave a great speech.
All the world today knows that we are here and we are standing before the forces of power in the state of Alabama saying we ain't gonna let nobody turn us around.
There's very few times in your life that you know that you're someplace that you're at a moment where this is one of those things that as long as there's time is going to be this moment. And that was it.
United States of America.
On August the 6th, Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, finally guaranteeing black Americans the right to vote.
Christine.
But just as it reached a high point, the civil rights movement seemed to split into warring factions.
A revolution of rising expectations stirs people to believe that the promised land is there. It was when change was coming, when there was a sense of possibility, that everything broke loose and went wild.
You're better than the white man. You are better than the white man. And that's not saying anything.
Despite the gains of recent years, it seemed to many blacks that the pace of change was too slow, that Martin Luther King was too accommodating. These blacks began to adopt the separatist rhetoric of the charismatic Malcolm X.
I used to hear Malcolm say, if a man slaps me in the face, I'm not turning my cheek. If I slap him back, he won't slap me again. That made a lot of sense.
Malcolm at that time said clearly, all right, what we need is power. While King would say what we need is morality to help bring out, Malcolm said, forget about them, just get guns, and that's how they're going to regulate the problem. The contradiction, however, was that Martin Luther King was involved in action, confronting the enemy. Malcolm X was not. So what you had to do was take the confrontation of King and match it as best you can with the philosophy of Malcolm X, which is precisely what we did.
We want black power. We want...
Okay, so we get the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and as it says here, the civil rights movement began to fracture. You had more militant blacks who wanted to use violence, or at least have it as an option, with Malcolm X and the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers. Malcolm X was very influential, but then he was assassinated, and so was Martin Luther King Jr. So you see at the very bottom of page 8. On April 4, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and there's a lot of they did arrest a guy, but some people don't think it's him, and it's a whole theory there. But riots broke out in the streets. There already had been riots before that because of racism in a lot of the big cities. And so things were falling apart for the civil rights movement. And at the same time, the Vietnam War was escalating rapidly. So after Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, the country was really in disarray, the most divided the country's ever been since the Civil War. And his legacy was to find resolution to racism with nonviolent protest and affirm faith in God. And that message still is propagated today. And hopefully you, by listening to him speak and hearing his speeches, that it had a profound impact on your ability to see racial problems in America. But we're going to end. We can't cover everything because of time, running out of time. So that's going to conclude our discussion of civil rights, and then we're going to move on into the Vietnam War.